Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us once again. As you know, this is part two of our four-part series for Pride Month. So our last session was a lot about terminology and just getting a foundation for some of the topics that we're going to be talking about throughout the series. And today, a lot of what we're talking about is going to be centered on the history of Pride Month, some very important figures and the voices behind it, and some good historical context as it relates to large milestones that have happened within the LGBTQIA plus communities. Without further ado, I'll introduce our presenters for the day. We have Kace, we have Jayde, as well as Madeline. And we have Officer Edwards as well. You will see him, he's not on screen, but I promise you he is here. Without further ado, Kace, feel free to take it away.
First, we're going to talk about some LGBTQ plus things throughout history. The evolution of pride, homosexuality in ancient Europe. The first public display of homosexuality in recorded history, ancient Greece, wasn't really a movement at all. A common thread of constructionist argument is that no one in antiquity experienced homosexuality as a permanent or defining mode of sexuality. Some argue that framing historical figures like Socrates and Plato, who have both engaged in same-sex relationships, in the context of today's social constructs is an injustice. The conception of sexuality differs too invariably from ours. Homosexuality in East Asia and the Middle East. In East Asia, same-sex love has been referred to since the earliest recorded history, known in China as the pleasures of the bidden peach, dating back to 600 BCE. The documentation of homosexuality in art and literature in Japan and Thailand has encouraged general acceptance by society, and neither have had legal prohibitions against homosexuality. Among modern Middle Eastern countries, same-sex intercourse officially carries the death penalty in several nations, including Saudi Arabia and Iran. Evidence of homosexuality in the Middle East can be traced back to at least until the time of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. Criminalization of same-sex acts was dependent on social status, much like heterosexual relationships. Gender identity in South Asia. The Laws of Manu, foundational work of Hindu law, mentions a third sex, the Hijra, members of which may engage in non-traditional gender expression and homosexual activities. Such homosexual men were known to marry according to the Kama Sutra written in the 4th century. There are also third sex citizens, sometimes greatly attached to one another and with complete faith in one another, who get married together. The term Hijra, according to Bangladeshi photographer Shahira Sharman, has no exact match in modern Western taxonomy of gender. Now we're going to talk about some important movements and theories.
The struggle for liberation, historical movements. Discriminatory laws. Social reformer Jeremy Bentham wrote the first known argument for homosexual law reform in England around 1785, at a time when the legal penalty for buggery was death by hanging. His advocacy stemmed from his utilitarian philosophy, in which the morality of an action is determined by the net consequence of that action on a human well-being. He argued that homosexuality was a victimless crime and therefore not deserving of social approbation or criminal charges. The gay liberation movement, which lasted from 1969 to 1974. A global trend of LGBT radicalism is often attributed to the Stonewall riots of 1969. The term gay first emerges and the relationship between gender identity and expression is called into question. Roughly 24 states had decriminalized sodomy by 1980, and some activists were already talking about the next frontier, legal recognition for marriage. The AIDS epidemic, which lasted from 1980 to 2000. Termed the gay plague, this era saw a resurgence of militancy with direct action groups. Demands for civil rights quickly devolved into pleas for recognition of a health crisis, and President Reagan failed to publicly utter the word AIDS until 1985, when over 12,000 Americans had died and the virus had begun to spread swiftly through hemophiliac populations and injection drug users. Even when medical combatants were developed much too late, access to them was limited to those who could afford them, and poor rural LGBT communities who were already disadvantaged by discriminatory workplace laws suffered because of it. Marriage equality. The Netherlands was the first country to allow same-sex marriage in 2001. South Africa, Norway, Portugal, Argentina, France, Uruguay, New Zealand, Austria, Taiwan, Ecuador, and many others followed suit in the coming years. On June 26, 2015, in Obergefell versus Hodges, the Supreme Court The Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the Constitution requires that same-sex couples be allowed to marry no matter where they live in the United States.
So in the chat, how would you describe identity politics? Have you ever heard of the term before? Does it have a positive or negative connotation? So identity politics from 1970 to now. Gender identity politics is an approach that views politics, both in practice and as an academic discipline, as having a gendered nature, and that gender is an identity that influences how people think. Some groups have combined identity politics with Marxist social class analysis and class consciousness. The most notable example being the Black Panther Party. Intersectional identity politics typically analyzes how the struggles of separate identities, gender, class, sexuality, ethnicity, etc., work in tandem to create unique realities for the subject. The struggle for liberation is argued is not fulfilled if, for example, working class and ethnicity minority LGBT members do not reap the same legal and social benefits as their wealthier white counterparts. The gender revolution abolition from 1970 to now. The theory of postgenderism focuses on eliminating or moving beyond gender identities. In a traditional gender construct, one is either a man or a woman, but in postgenderism, one is neither a man nor a woman, nor any other assumed gender role. Thus, an individual in society is not reduced to gender role, but is simply an agent of humanity, who is not defined, if at all, by one's actions. Rainbow marketing and exploitation, also termed as gay capitalism. Rainbow marketing is the incorporation of the LGBT movement, sexual diversity, and pinkwashing to capitalism, consumerism, and the market economy. As the general support of LGBTQ rights grows, so does the corporate incentive for rebrands and companies to position themselves in sync with that growing sentiment. But in that commercialization lies the disconnect. Brands promoting gay pride in the LGBTQ community may not always be consistent in actually supporting the LGBTQ community, but they still capitalize on the help that people want to give that community. So in the chat, is all progress good progress? Is equality the same as liberation?
Leave it on the screen for a quick minute.
Nationalism. This lens for viewing LGBTQ advancements asks the question, can queer liberation exist without upholding systems of oppression?
Hi, I'm Sean Fay, and this is Sean This Way. And in this installment, I'm going to be asking, what is homo-nationalism? Homo-nationalism is a term that was coined by academic Jayde in her landmark text, Terrorist Assemblages, Homo-Nationalism in Queer Times, which marks its 10th anniversary this year. And if you're unsure how to celebrate the 10th birthday of a landmark text in queer theory and Foucauldian biopolitics, then look no further, because I've already thrown the party. At times, especially in activist circles, the concept has become somewhat simplified just to mean any time that LGBT liberation politics could be co-opted by the nationalisms of the far right. For example, the National Front's appeal to white gay people in France based on racist fear-mongering about Muslim homophobia, or in the US, the rise of pro-right LGBT slogans and groups, including, among others, Twinks for Trump. While this phenomenon of fascism or white supremacy co-opting LGBT politics for its own ends is real and alarming, it's not exactly what homo-nationalism is. Homo-nationalism, as Poir intends it, is an analysis or organizing principle of global politics, not a personal ideology that you can choose or disavow as an individual. This isn't about good gays or bad gays. Terrorist Assemblages was a rejection of the ideas sometimes found in feminist and queer theory of the 90s that the nation state is always heteronormative and that the queer citizen is always an alien or outlaw within it. Instead, Poir argues that homonationalism is how acceptance and tolerance for gay and lesbian subjects have become a barometer by which the right to and capacity for national sovereignty is evaluated. So what does this mean? Well, in other words, it means that it's not about when LGBT people and racism visibly join forces, but a critique which basically argues that all liberal lesbian and gay rights movements uphold certain ideas of social progress and modernity. In particular, LGBT equality movements rest on the basic assumption that the Western nation state is capable of expanding to include all marginalized populations and capable of being a benefactor to all its subjects. Poir argues that these assumptions and discourses cannot be true, as they always afford some populations full legal and cultural citizenship at the expense of others, specifically racialized others, both at home and internationally. A simple example would be the progress towards marriage equality. Marriage has been considered the pinnacle of gay and lesbian participation in civic life, and marriage does provide equality with straight citizens, but it also upholds an institution which, for example, entrenches Western sexual and family norms as supreme and exceptional in comparison to those of other cultures. Marriage also upholds the nation state as the supreme arbiter of sexuality, in the way that it sometimes allows those inside the institution right to remain or citizenship, while others outside of it can be deported. A more modern example 10 years on could be transgender rights. So, for example, as part of the social and legal process of transitioning within a nation state, a trans woman like me may apply to obtain a female passport. While this can be considered a success of a modern trans rights movement and an example of the excellence of a liberal nation state which allows its trans citizens full participation in national life, the very existence of passports still upholds the sovereignty of the nation state to police its borders, to arrest and detain and deport those who do not have documentation, and its role in using the passport system for surveillance and monitoring of racialized minorities as part of counterterrorism efforts, as well as all of the capitalist exclusions that come with non-citizenship. Does that mean that I'm not going to apply for a passport? Of course not. And this is what's meant by homonationalism being more of a lens to view queer politics through than a bad political philosophy you can simply disavow. However, 10 years on from the release of terrorist assemblages, which was largely considered the leading queer analysis after 9/11 and the war on terror, we find ourselves in a rather different political landscape. How, for example, do queer communities alive to the critique of homonationalism respond to President Trump's attempt to ban transgender people from serving in the US military this year? Trump's intention was not merely to signify that trans people are a burden to the health and vitality of the nation state, but to use the publicly funded healthcare of trans service personnel as a wider testing ground for policies around publicly funded healthcare, and namely whose bodies are disposable. However, in order to contradict the symbolism of the move, it's difficult not to recreate homonationalist discourses, namely that US trans citizens are fully entitled to participate in their country's military-industrial complex, or, to put it more bluntly, that American trans people are just as good at killing brown people overseas as cis people. When LGBT rights for the white and or citizened become actively forced into reverse, homonationalist discourses entrench themselves in response. So what is the solution? Well, perhaps it's to look at the point of universal healthcare instead of the military, and to fight Trump on the position that some bodies are entitled to public healthcare while others are not. Applying the lens of homonationalism should be a call for greater debate and critique of what liberation looks like, its shape, its form, and its limitations. Homonationalism is a huge, complex, and expansive subject, which I can only begin to touch on in a social media shareable. But if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from this video, is that it is not a political position designed to separate good politics from bad politics, but rather better thought of as a structure through which queer politics and liberation are formed. Rather than providing us with answers on the right way to struggle, if only things were that easy, homonationalism invites us to harshly critique our own role in global politics even as we gather under the banner of queer liberation or anti-racist politics. I want to know absolutely anything you think about anything I've discussed in the video today, whether that's homo nationalism, whether it's Jazz Bipoir's book, whether it's passports, whether it's Trump and trans military personnel, any of it. Hit me up in the comments below, tweet me at Sean Fay, use the hashtag Sean This Way, and don't forget to follow Novara Media at Novara Media. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.
All right, so now we're going to talk about some important events in LGBTQ plus history here in the US. We are going to start in 1924. 1924 was the first gay rights group was established. The first gay rights group was established. The Society of Human Rights was founded by World War I veteran Henry Gerber in Chicago. The group's newsletter, Friendship and Freedom, was the first gay rights publication in the United States. And in January 1958 was the Supreme Court rules in favor of gay rights. After the US Post Office refused to mail out Americans' first widely distributed pro-gay magazine, the case went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of gay rights for the first time in history, which leads us to June 28th of 1969, the Stonewall riots. These riots sparked the true beginning of the LGBTQ liberation movement. Starting when police performed a raid at the Stonewall Inn, a gay bar in New York City, the customers took a stand, causing riots that lasted for a couple of days. And now we're going to shift into a video of how the Stonewall riots sparked the movement.
In the early morning hours of June 28, 1969, a riot broke out in front of the Stonewall Inn in New York City. The violent protest became known as the Stonewall Riots. The Stonewall Riots were a watershed moment in the gay rights movement, sparking activism and awareness across the United States. We'll look at the roots of the riots, the events, and their lasting impact. In the 1950s and 60s, homosexuality was still considered sodomy and illegal in 49 states. The punishments varied greatly by state, ranging from heavy fines to imprisonment. In society, members of the gay community were often subject to violence, harassment, and discrimination. In New York City, gay bars were havens for people with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, places where they could avoid harassment and violence. The Stonewall Inn served as a popular refuge. The Stonewall Inn was owned by the Mafia. The Mafia bribed the police to look the other way. In turn, the Mafia made money overcharging patrons for drinks. Even so, the patrons were not fully safe from homophobia and discrimination. The Mafia would extort wealthy patrons, threatening to out them to their employers and families. Despite the Mafia's bribes, the police still regularly raided the Stonewall Inn and other gay bars, charging them with solicitation of homosexual relations. Trans and other gender nonconforming people were also targeted, subjected to violence, and arrested if they weren't wearing what the police deemed gender-appropriate clothing. This oppression and mistreatment came to a head in the early morning hours of June 28, 1969. 9 police officers entered the Stonewall Inn in a raid. The patrons were fed up. As the police roughly tried to arrest bartenders and customers, many resisted. Outside the bar, people in the hundreds began rioting. They threw bottles at the police and pushed through the barricades. The police officers retreated from the crowd and locked themselves inside the Stonewall Inn. Rioters responded by setting the bar on fire. Police reinforcement arrived, and the original officers managed to get out of the burning bar. Meanwhile, the angry mob had grown into thousands. Eventually, the police were able to get the crowd to disperse, but it didn't last long. The riots continued until July 1st. While some criticized the violent and destructive riots, others pointed to the brutality and unjust treatment of the gay community. This large-scale defiance made a massive impact on society. The Stonewall riots were the beginning of the modern gay liberation movement, which also brought attention to others marginalized for their sexual or gender orientation. The riots sparked the formation of the Gay Liberation Front, the first group to publicly advocate for equal gay rights. On the one-year anniversary of the riots, they also organized the first Gay Pride Parade. Today, Pride events are still held on the anniversary of the Stonewall riots in cities around the country and even the world. In 2016, President Obama made the Stonewall Inn and the area outside where the riots broke out a national monument. This became the first national monument celebrating gay history. The Stonewall riots may have been violent, but they marked a pivotal moment in history. No longer would people quietly endure the stigma associated with their sexual and gender orientations. Through the Stonewall riots, the gay rights movement gained mainstream visibility and a momentum that continues to this day.
Got it? All right, which brings us to April 2000, where Vermont takes steps towards same-sex marriage. Vermont becomes the first state to allow same-sex couples the rights to enter civil unions, legal partnerships that would grant the couple same rights as those in legal marriages. In September 2011, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell is gone. The Don't Ask, Don't Tell law created to prevent openly gay Americans from serving in the military was revoked. And June 26th of 2015, where love wins. Gay marriage is now made legal and a constitutional right in all 50 states. July of 2015, the U.S. military allows transgender people to serve. The military lifts the ban that would prevent transgender Americans to serve the military. And then in May 2016, the Stonewall Inn becomes a national monument. The Obama administration announced the preparation to designate the Stonewall Inn the first ever national monument dedicated to the LGBTQ plus rights. And then June 2016, the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, the immediate caring response from politicians, the public, and the President of the United States, who reached out to express outrage and concern, demonstrates the enormous shift towards acceptance and public support for the LGBTQ community. And now in the chat, do you know why the pride flag is a rainbow? You can answer yes or no in the chat.
You recognize this flag, right? And this? And this? Well, these flags represent a place, a nation. But today we'll talk about this flag, which represents people globally. We all identify the rainbow flag as the worldwide symbol of the LGBTQIA rights movement. But have you ever thought, why? Do you know the first pride flag was very different from the one we see today? So let's start the story with the man who designed it. Gilbert Baker, San Francisco-based queer rights activist, Vietnam War veteran, artist, and a drag queen. He created the Rainbow Pride flag. Harvey Milk, then a rising queer activist, had urged Baker to create a symbol of pride, something the queer community could identify with. This was to replace the pink triangle, which was conceived by Adolf Hitler, intended to be a badge of shame. But this homophobic badge was later embraced by the queer community as a symbol of pride. Baker wanted to do away with the depressing history that the triangle carried. He wanted something positive, something that celebrated love. Coming back to the story. So in 1976, Baker realized that flags are a sign of rebellion, revolution, and power. A flag fit with the mission of the LGBTQIA plus people to live in the truth, to be visible and proclaim, this is who I am. But where did the rainbow come from? Well, just like in the movies, as Gilbert explains it. He was dancing with his friend Cleve Jones, and the dance fused him. Swirl of color and light consumed him like a rainbow. Baker designed the flag with 8 stripes. Pink for sex, red for life, orange for healing, yellow for sunlight, green for nature, turquoise for magic, indigo for harmony, violet for spirit. With 30 volunteers, Baker hand-stitched and hand-dyed the first 2 flags. They were flown at the Pride Parade in San Francisco on 25 June 1978. November 1978, Harvey Milk, the first openly gay San Francisco city supervisor, was assassinated.
Supervisor Harvey Milk have been shot and killed.
Protests increased, and so did the demand for the pride flag. Since the fabric was in short supply for mass production of flags, eventually hot pink and turquoise were dropped. 25 years after Baker first unveiled it, he went on to set a world record in 2003. He stitched a 1.25-mile-long flag with all 8 colors to mark its anniversary. The flag was cut into sections and distributed across 100 cities across the world. The rainbow flag became more than just a flag. It gave people hope. In 2017, to make the flag more inclusive, brown and black colors were added, which reflect Black and brown members of the queer community.
Now we're going to talk about some important people in LGBTQ plus history. Marsha P. Johnson was a transgender activist born in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and later moved to Greenwich Village in New York. I was a nobody from Nowheresville until I became a drag queen. Johnson identified as a transvestite, gay, and a drag queen, and used she, her pronouns. She was homeless throughout most of her life, one of many experiences her activism was rooted in. She founded STAR, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, to give shelter and resources to homeless LGBTQ plus youth. She died in 1992. Her death was ruled as self-inflicted. However, 25 years later, a crime victim advocate of the New York AVP by the name of Victoria Cruz reopened her case.
Sylvia Rivera was raised by her grandmother. She started experimenting with makeup and clothes when she was very young and was beaten for doing so. After being attacked at school by another student, she was suspended from school for a week. She ran away from home at age 11. She met Marsha P. Johnson in 1963 at the age of 12, describing Johnson, "She was like a mother to me." Known for her role in the Stonewall riots, leading a series of protests against the police raids, she helped found the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, STAR, with Marsha P. Johnson around 1971. The Star House was a building that lodged/took in any homeless LGBTQ plus teens who needed it. She started the Transy House in 1997, modeled after the Star House. In 2021, a monument in New York City was unveiled in honor of Rivera as well as Johnson, the world's first monument dedicated to transgender individuals.
And then we're going to talk about Larry Kramer a little bit. He co-founded multiple advocacy groups such as Gay Men's Health Crisis, GMHC, and ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. Kramer and other activists held die-ins during the AIDS epidemic. Die-in protests are described as when protesters lie on the ground and pretend to be dead in an attempt to symbolize that the person or topic being protested against has murdered or killed people. Die-ins grab the attention of the media and force the government and people in power to finally address the AIDS epidemic. His actions helped the FDA push experimental drugs that would later go on to extend the lives of many living with HIV and AIDS.
Harvey Milk was the first openly gay elected official in the history of California. He served in the Navy for several years before resigning after being questioned about his sexual orientation, and he helped find one of the first predominantly LGBTQ plus business groups in the U.S., the Castro Village Association. He was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 1977, and he helped get rid of Proposition 6, which would have required the firing of all gay and lesbian teachers in California. "If a bullet should enter my brain, let that bullet destroy every closet door in the country." He was assassinated in 1978 at City Hall. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Freedom by Obama in 2009.
And that's her presentation.
Well, I'm gonna clap it up for you guys.